Here we go. Dr. Hicks, thank you very much for joining me on the Third Party Show today. For me, this is actually a wonderful pleasure. I was extremely excited when you replied to my email and said you'd come on the show. I was jumping up and down like a child. My wife still thinks it's quite funny.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that.
Yeah. Well, I think it's justified. I mean, I see you as being the preeminent source on postmodernism at the moment. Your videos, which I stumbled across a couple of years ago on YouTube, are incredibly informative and really tie into what seems to be happening in Western culture today. So thank you for your time. I was wondering if we might start with you giving a little bit of an introduction about yourself, how you got into the field of philosophy, and then give us a little bit of an introduction to postmodernism, and then maybe we'll move into some other areas about how it's affecting the society today, what might come after it, and some thoughts in that area.
Yeah, okay. Well, I came to postmodernism late. I guess the quick bio sketches, I was born in Canada, grew up in Canada, did my undergraduate research in Canada. At that time, I was actually planning to go into engineering and architecture. My father had been in kind of a real estate entrepreneur. And so I'd always been interested in the building trades and design issues. At the same time, I loved reading all over the place when I was young. Partly my parents' influence, they also were big readers. And I knew my engineering architecture training was going to be very narrow and technical. So before I went to that university, I went to another university to study liberal arts. And there I took courses in history and literature and philosophy and theater and so on. And I was keeping up on my maths and sciences as well, but kind of fell in love with philosophy during my undergraduate years. Not serious about it as a career, but avocationally, and so reading all over the place. And I ended up with a major in philosophy. But then I ran out of money, so I was working to save money to go back for my real degree, as I thought of it. But then I had an internal crisis about whether I really wanted to pursue architecture or whether I wanted to try this philosophy thing as a career. And the job statistics are pretty grim for finding professor jobs in philosophy, but I thought, what the heck?
Give it a go.
Yeah, give it a go. So I applied to some of the top schools in the States, and I had a strong recommendation from one of my professors in philosophy of science, Michael Roos, who had strong connections with Indiana's philosophy of science and history program. And they also had a very strong program in logic. And they made a nice offer to me, so I went to Indiana for grad school. I did end up getting a job in the U.S. in philosophy, and overall, I think it's been the right choice. So to come to postmodernism, though, in a way, I think all of my training put me in a good position to understand it, because as the name suggests, postmodernism, the postmoderns really have a big picture philosophical and historical understanding. So they're taking the entirety of modern philosophy, the entirety of the modern world, and saying that is wrong, that is a failure, that is a disaster, and we need to go post that to something else, something completely different. And then at the same time, they're saying, a lot of conservatives, of course, will say the modern world has been a big disaster and it's all problematic. But what the conservatives of that sort will typically say is what we need to do is go back to pre-modern insights and revivify or the best of those traditions in the modern world. So we have then both the postmoderns and the pre-moderns. And the postmoderns are typically more on the left politically. The pre-moderns are typically more on the right politically, but both of them are adversaries of this modernist project and think of it as a failure. Now, in a way, I think my undergraduate training, which was mostly in history of philosophy, I took just courses on the entirety of the history of philosophy, most of the time one-on-one courses with professors who were experts in their field, in Aristotle, in Kant, in Aquinas, in Descartes, in John Rawls, and Nietzsche, and so on. So I had a very good historical grounding about the sweep of historical developments in philosophy as they had occurred. And so when the postmoderns come along, and people like Heidegger, who's not quite a postmodernist, but very close to it, he's very influential on all of the postmodernists. Say, that the entirety of Western philosophy needs to be kind of put in brackets, and we need to set that aside. And then Foucault and Derrida and Rorty are doing that sort of thing. We can come back to these guys. I knew what they were talking about, and I could say, well, that's an important thesis, and that's a very difficult thing for most of us to wrap our minds around. The other thing I think, though, is the politics. Aside from the philosophy, I had a strong interest in political philosophy and political theory. And actually, the professor in university, Fred Vaughn, who was a University of Chicago PhD, very well-read man, very good lecturer, kind of turned me on to political philosophy in my first year of university. And so on the basis of that, I was reading a lot of the political philosophers as well as the straight philosophers. And when I was young, I was a Cold War baby, so to speak. So growing up with Russia versus America, communism versus capitalism, and nuclear Armageddon. So I had been reading a lot of Russian history and so on to try to figure out what was going on there. So I had a pretty good, I would say, layman's understanding of the history of political developments as well. So that kind of came together in the 1990s for me when I'd finished my PhD work and I was a young professor looking for what I should write on next. And I said, these postmoderns seem to be all over the place, and it's very politicized. And I understand the politics and I understand the philosophy. So my work on postmodernism came out of that. So that's the bio sketch. Let me pause there, though, so you can get a word in edgewise.
There's a lot of things there that I'd like to ask about. One of them is why the rejection of the modern time and the modern philosophy. What is it that they see as being the failure? When you look at if we look at Western culture has delivered, lifting people out of poverty and technology and medicine and all these things which you consider to be positives and I guess successes, what do they see as being that failure which causes them to reject logic and reject that modernity?
Yeah, well, I think there are two answers to that, or that I will say are the most important ones. One philosophical, one political. I think the philosophical one is, and I think the more honest seekers within postmodernism, they can be very intelligent people who study their philosophy. They study issues in cognition, logic, semantics, philosophy of language, and so on, and they will reach skeptical conclusions. So there's a long tradition of skepticism, but it's also the case that by the time we get to the middle part of the 20th century, when postmodernism as a movement starts to get formed, philosophy was at a very skeptical moment. It tends to go in cycles of optimism and pessimism about the possibility of truth and knowledge and so on. But it was in a deep valley, both in the mainstream continental traditions, continental philosophy traditions, but also in the more logic-friendly Anglo-American traditions. Logical positivism had collapsed. Analytic philosophy in general was kind of in the doldrums in the 1950s. So I think one possibility is just to say, well, look, we can have this belief that logic and reason are powerful and competent, but then when we look at the arguments and you do what professional philosophers do, you break everything down, and if there's any weakness, they will find that weakness, and then they will push it to the limit. That's their job, and the limit is some sort of skeptical, nobody really knows anything, and so much of philosophy was in that place in the middle part of the 50s. And so I think it's important here that the first generation important philosophers, Richard Rorty, brilliant guy, Michel Foucault, probably the most famous of them, Jean-Francois Lyotard, Jacques Derrida, they're all PhDs in philosophy. They are reading philosophy at its skeptical strongest at that time. And so I think they come to believe, logic and reason are oversold, and we have to set them aside for something else.
Do you think that they
So
would...
that would be one answer.
Do you think on that point, do you think they would have expected the cultural impacts of that philosophy? The ability to say, hey, yes, we see these flaws in modernism, and there are areas where we can argue that logic perhaps isn't 100% something you can believe upon or base all of your philosophy upon. But do you think they would have expected the sort of impacts on society that have come from people adopting that and working with that as a philosophy?
I think that depends. And here postmoderns in general split into at least two camps. Some of them are more ivory tower intellectual people, and they're just interested in the arguments and what this means for practical affairs and culture. I don't know, I don't care, I'm not particularly interested. And so I'm just an academic skeptic, and I think skepticism is the truth, right? So to speak, if we can use that language. But there are others who will say that this is actually culturally beneficial because skepticism opens up a space for some kind of cultural activism. So we do know, for example, lots of time people will, when they are young, come to have beliefs in all sorts of things. And those beliefs come to be important to them, my core values, my identity. And when there are logical and rational arguments against their position, they find that very unsettling.
Yeah.
And so anything that comes along and allows them to say, well, maybe logic isn't that important. Maybe being rational isn't that important. That's going to be valuable to them because then they can say, oh, okay. Yeah. So I don't have to take those rational, logical arguments too seriously. I can still, and I'm going to use a pejorative language, I can still indulge the beliefs that I really, in my heart of hearts, want to believe. So we know sometimes people do that in religion. Sometimes they do that in relationships. Sometimes they do that in politics. So this then I think comes to the second part of the answer. I think some of the postmoderns, they come to their skepticism through politics. So the other great story of the modern world is the one that you're talking about. Obviously, it's reason and logic and science and experimental method, and we figured out all this stuff, and it's a very glorious, optimistic story. But also part of the modern world has been the celebration of individual rights, the pursuit of happiness, some sort of democratic liberalism, freeing the slaves, making women equally liberal, right, and so on. But also free market capitalism is part and parcel of that story. And capitalism, as you suggested, has been one of the great success stories of all time, liberating so many people out of poverty. But what happens, though, if you as a young person come to believe that capitalism is bad, that capitalism is evil, and that you become committed to, say, some sort of socialism or some sort of fascism or communism, some sort of strongly anti-capitalist ideology? And in many cases, young people, particularly intelligent young people who start to think about big picture things, they do so before they've got a lot of experience, before they've done a lot of history, and they make a kind of leap into a political ideology that seems true, beautiful, right, whatever it is, and it's strongly anti-capitalistic. So at that point, then you have a problem. Suppose, for example, you commit to some sort of socialism or some sort of communism or fascism, and then you're a little bit older and you start to learn some history, you start to learn some political realities and so on. Then again, you're going to have a crisis because then it looks like, damn it, capitalism has done all of these wonderful things, right? But I hate capitalism. Yeah. So how can I argue against capitalism, or how can I set capitalism aside? And then any sort of ideology that comes along and says, well, all those logical and empirical, statistical, scientific, empirical arguments for capitalism. Well, if you have a philosophy like postmodernism that says, well, that's just a story. That's just a narrative. And everybody makes up their own narratives. And that gives you a way to bracket all of that, put it to the one side, and find some other way of, again, I will use the pejorative, indulging your commitment to your political ideals. Now, here I think it's important, again, biographically. Richard Rorty was born of communist parents. They were hardcore Trotskyites. Now, he drifted away to what we would now think of as still pretty far on the left end of the political spectrum. But nonetheless, he lived and breathed that territory of the political spectrum. Sort of capitalist liberalism was just from the get-go morally anathema to him. Michel Foucault was a committed Marxist. He joined the French Communist Party when he was in his 20s. Now, again, he left the French Communist Party, but that's where he started. And in his heart of hearts, some sort of hard leftism was in his bones. The same thing is true of Lyotard. The same thing is true, actually not quite the same. They didn't join the party, but they were ideologically and intellectually and emotionally committed to some sort of Marxist philosophy. And they would say so explicitly. So what you have then is also, and I'm just focusing on these four as kind of exemplars of postmodernism. They are very well educated in philosophy, but they are at the same time as young men committed to a certain brand of far left politics.
Already.
So postmodernism is a marriage of those two strands, at least in the first generation.
Yeah. It seems as though postmodernism taps into some human behaviors or some human desires. It seems to give you, at least if we go back beyond, say, postmodernism to Marxism, that utopia, that idea there that you can reject what you might be dealing with today in your day and life in your world, and we'll offer you something, and there's a utopia at the end of it. And postmodernism seems to give, I think, also for the young people who may be involved in socialism, an ability to rebel against what's there today, which I remember at my university days. I never moved into a political party, but the idea of socialism and Che Guevara and all those guys were great, at that time, because it was a rebellion against what we were moving into, which is looking towards, I'm going to move into a corporate world and get a job doing this or that, that sort of thing. So I think that there's a strong appeal there with postmodernism to a lot of young people, which is perhaps why we see so many activists these days who are young in the postmodernist areas.
I think there's a lot of truth to what you're saying there. But I want to just going to add a kind of a complementary point, because I remember having the same rebellious things. But I think pretty much everybody, though, who grows up in the Western world, you might have the idea that one of the options for you is to go and work in the corporate world. And you might say, that's not for me, right? But what we all very clearly got the message was, look, you don't have to go to work in the corporate world. But of course, for some people, that's a perfectly legitimate option. You can do wonderful things inside the corporate world, and corporations have done some great things. But if that's not for you, then be an entrepreneur. And so we are kind of the generations in the modern world that has said, there's just all of these opportunities, all these jobs, there's more jobs available, more kinds of jobs available. Go start a rock and roll band if you want to, and travel the world and do all of these sorts of things. And if you don't like any of the existing jobs that are out there, well, start your own business. Yeah. And it's at the same time, for 200 years, this has been the most entrepreneurial and encouraging entrepreneurship culture as well. So what I want to then suggest is that yes, there is something alienating about going into the stereotypical corporate world for many people. You don't want to do that. But if you want to say that's your reason for rejecting the entirety of Western civilization, I don't think that's really the story, right? Because people know in Western civilization, they have a lot of other options available to them. So did you see the movie The Fight Club?
Yes.
It came out in 1999 or something like that.
Brad Pitt and Edward Norton. Yes.
Yeah, Edward Norton, Brad Pitt, and Helena Bonham Carter.
That's right.
It's a kind of very well done movie. And I think it uses a lot of classic modernist, well-developed structuring in the service of some postmodern themes. So there's another element here that's not necessarily about cognitive skepticism or a narrower commitment to a political ideology that I think attracts a number of people to postmodernism. And the corporation idea is, I think, a kind of a whipping boy that they use from that perspective. So if you think about something like the Fight Club, the idea here is you've got a man who, as a young man, feels alienated from life and from culture. And it's not a political alienation. It's not really even a cognitive alienation. It might be he doesn't have a religious connection. It's the death of God and all of those themes as well. But he doesn't have any central meaning or purpose in his life. And so he feels empty inside. And the idea is that in some sense, he wants to say it's contemporary society's fault that it has not provided me with meaning that I can pour myself into. And so on the basis of that, excuse me, I in effect need to go to war against society in order and do all kinds of anti-social things in order to find some way of igniting a sense of purpose and meaning in my life. And it takes something pretty extreme like joining the Fight Club, where men batter each other, but then at least I'm feeling something. I'm feeling alive, even if I'm feeling painful and miserable. And I've got a clear purpose. I need to beat that guy up before he beats me. But in all of that, what you find is a quest for a kind of meaning that has not been provided for you. And then at the end of the movie, there is that scene where to say, if we do all of this, what in some sense it requires is that we have to blow up all of society. And it's not just the corporations, it's everything in society has to be blown up. And so that strikes me that there's something more profoundly alienating at work in these individuals. Whatever modern society is offering to them in religion, in family life, in business life, in the artistic life, they're not connected to it. And so they feel hostility to the whole project. And then I think if you are in a nihilistic place for a long time, it eats you up because you're still a human being.
Yeah.
And human beings want to manifest their energy in some way. And so if you are terribly nihilistic inside and frustrated, the only way that can come out is in the form of kind of external destructiveness. And I think that can be attractive psychologically to many people attracted to postmodernism.
So what is that meaning? What do you think that meaning is that people maybe are lacking? Or if you were going to take this another way and suggest a philosophy to go beyond postmodernism, would you need to have something that tackled that gap in meaning for people to make it attractive?
Oh, I think yes, absolutely. So if you think of the great anthem of the Enlightenment and the modern world, the idea that individuals have the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that what we are going to do is kind of eliminate feudalism, where everyone is given a prepackaged place in society and restrictions. This is what you are supposed to do. And even on religious matters, we are not going to have a prepackaged religion. You need to find your own religion or no religion at all. And so you're on your life is yours. You are a free agent and the pursuit of happiness is yours. Well, that is a great anthem for many people, but at the same time, that can be a very daunting project. Right?
Yes.
So if it's not going to be that religion is going to hand you a prepackaged life with your rights and duties and responsibilities and how you're supposed to behave, if government is not going to hand you your prepackaged life, you are a total free agent.
Suddenly the responsibility is yours to get it right.
Exactly. And that's big.
Yeah.
That's big. And we can just, we don't have to imagine, we know for many people that's too big.
Yeah.
And they're not up to the task for whatever reason. Now, why they are not up to the task, well, then we have to drill down to how the individuals are raised, what incentives, what liberties. But no, if we're going to prepare people really for and the kind of life that the Enlightenment figures promised, a life of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That means by the time you are an adult, you need to have a lot of knowledge, a lot of skills, a lot of self-esteem and confidence that you can take on the world. And so you've got 18 years to build up some pretty competent, powerful, resilient individuals to turn them loose into that kind of society. And if parenting and the educational system and whatever is not doing that job, then you're going to be turning loose lots of people who are frustrated, alienated, and they're going to then go looking for something to either to manifest their alienation on destructively, or they're going to look for someone to look after them in some way.
And that's, I guess, where things like socialism also have an appeal, where you're going to have a centralized control, sort of tyrannical state, but they're going to be telling you what to do. You don't have to worry about that anymore.
Exactly right.
Yeah,
sure, that's right. And that can also come in religious form. People attracted to all kinds of cults, where you will have a leader who will tell you what to think and what to do, and you're part of a community that's going to look after you. And in a way, you just have to surrender yourself to that cult community, and all will be fine. It's
interesting that if philosophy, trying to think of what might replace postmodernism, it almost does feel like a political platform where you sort of need to sit that centrist area to be able to get, entice people over here who would like the pursuit of freedom and happiness and be able to be entrepreneurs and go that way, but also be able to attract people who perhaps haven't got that confidence and want some of that support. So when you were talking before about the ivory tower philosophers who are maybe very skeptical and be black and white about their position, when you move into the real world, do you think we need to have more grey? Like, is there, for example, with postmodernism, are there some good points to it today which we should be using and adopting in our culture, or is it something that you feel like is more damaging than good, and we should be rejecting it and looking for something new?
Yeah, no, I think definitely the latter. I think many people are attracted to some elements of postmodernism, but those are typically kind of watered down elements of postmodernism, and they actually are things that carry over from modernism. So, for example, many people who describe themselves, young people, as postmodern, they will see it as being about liberation and fighting against, say, racism and sexism and so on, and against all of the arbitrary restrictions of the past. Now, if that's what postmodernism means to you, and that's what many people will say postmodernism means to you, well, that's not really postmodernism, because that's been the modernist fight for 3 or 4 centuries. But what that does, of course, mean is that you have to be against certain existing power structures. But that also is a modernist theme, being against arbitrary power structures as well. So I think when you define postmodernism more carefully, then that's you have a number of negative elements there, and those, I think, are all false and then ultimately destructive. So take for example much of what we now call wokeism. You'll find people there who are anti-racist or anti-sexist, just to take two things for example. And I think when they are young, 18 to 22 years, I think they can be genuine in their anti-racism and so on. But if you ask, what does it mean to be anti-racist? They haven't necessarily got that clearly defined, and they have a kind of cartoon understanding of where we are right now with respect to racism and sexism in contemporary modern society. So they'll have a naive attraction to those movements, but it's not clear to me whether they're actually modernist or whether they are postmodernist in their, say, anti-racism. And then by the time they become more mature, suppose you're now talking about a 30-year-old, what does it mean to you then to be anti-racist? Do you mean that what we should do is treat individuals, as having some agency, and that we judge people according to their character, and we buy into, say, the Martin Luther King Jr. judging people by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. And so that racism is this old collectivist group identity and kind of automatic prejudice. If that's what your anti-racism is, then you're a modernist.
Yeah.
Because those themes of individualism and agency and judging people by their character, that's a long, long tradition now, 300 years or so old. But by the time you get to a 30-year-old, if you say, well, what does your anti-racism mean? If you're the kind of answer that person is getting is to say, well, the world is divided into these groups, these racial groups, and they all have their own ways of looking at the world and their own completely different value frameworks, and they're all in these adversarial relations with each other. And anti-racism means my making a commitment to my racial group and hating on all of the other racial groups. But my racism is okay because my racial group is one that's been beat up on by the other racial groups in history. If that's what your anti-racism means, then you are a postmodern anti-racist. So, so to come back to your question, to say, are there good elements in postmodernism? I think you have to ask whether you're defining loosely what attracts or carefully.
Perhaps there are modernist elements of postmodernism. Some, like you were saying before, where depending on how you define things, perhaps you're really a modernist and not a postmodernist.
Yeah.
So you've had years of studying philosophy. What is your philosophy? How would you describe your sort of guiding philosophy, or what you align with, or what perhaps you think we should be pursuing?
Yeah. Well, I'll give a broad answer and then some specific answers to that question. So broadly speaking, I am an Enlightenment philosophy guy, right? So that means pro-science, pro-technology, underlying both of them, pro-reason, empiricism, experimental method in our cognitive. Pro-individualist, I think we are individuals, right, by nature. We have agency, we have free will. We can decide our beliefs, we can decide our character. And I think that properly defined, our interests can be harmonious. And so my respecting your freedom rights and your respecting mine works out. And where we can't find agreements, we go our separate ways, or we just tolerate each other. The institutions of some sort of democratic republicanism politically, where we're decentralizing power, we're respecting and empowering individuals in the political system. So people have their ironclad rights, but also the political system is ours. It's a do-it-yourself type of process. The same thing applying to the economic sphere. Your economic life is yours. You know, you're free to go into whatever career you want, to do business with whomever you want, to go bankrupt or to make $1 billion. If you've earned it in the market, then you get to keep it. And then all of that put together with a kind of optimistic idea that individuals that way, free, rational individuals, can basically solve in principle all of the problems that have plagued human beings. So we can become wealthier, we can become freer, we can make the world a more beautiful place, we can live longer, we can probe the ultimate questions of the universe and come up with better answers as time goes on. So that's the general answer, right, I would give. Broadly speaking, then if you go historically, I am much more Aristotelian than I am Platonic or sophistic. In terms of modern philosophy, I like much of John Locke for his political philosophy, his views on religious toleration. I like Friedrich Nietzsche's critiques, not as a positive philosopher. I disagree with almost everything positively he says, but I think he's very brilliant at critiquing many of the main figures in earlier philosophy, and we can learn a lot from them. I agree with a significant amount of Karl Popper in his epistemological. I have some medium to big disagreements with him, but I think he's more or less one of the good guys. And then Ayn Rand, also in the 20th century, I have more comprehensive agreement with with her on her philosophical views. So that's a mixture of general and particular answers to that question.
What are the Popper areas that you disagree with?
Well, then we have to get fairly quickly into some of the technical issues in logic. So, I think he's very good on delineating the distinctions between science and pseudoscience. So the cognitive habits and practices that we get into between those who are genuinely truth seekers and those who are fudging or cheating, right, or playing a different game, right, in various ways as well. Where the biggest disagreement, I think, would come in is when you get into the weeds on the doctrine of falsification. So, there he wants to say there is no such thing as a positive logic of confirmation. There's only a logic of disconfirmation that's possible. I think that's a mistake. I understand his reasons for it. At the same time, I think there is an element of that is healthy. That part of a rational mindset is whatever hypothesis you are considering, that you are willing to put it out there, so to speak, to have it tested and challenged, and you are you're not just saying, but you are in principle willing to change your mind if it does become falsified. So that element, I think, is healthy. Some other things are, about the relationship between perception and our formation of concepts. So try to recapitulate. So we'll just be amateur child developmental psychologists here. You start at the sensation level, and then the world becomes more broken into units, that perceptual objects that are interacting in various ways. And then we start to put things into categories and assign words to them. And then at a point, we're able to put propositions together and speak in sentences, and then in paragraphs, and then in entire narratives. And so there's this building block, conceptual development of the entire apparatus as our minds become increasingly powerful. Well, one of the big philosophical issues is what's the connection between our perceptual awareness of the world, of discrete individuals, with their own unique properties, and our conceptual understanding of the world, where we have those individuals put into more abstracted and depersonalized categories. So that when I look at you, for example, on the other side of the world, but I'm seeing Tim, who's a particular guy, with particular shapes and colors and mass in a gravitational field. So you've got weight as well. So you are very individual and particular. But then at the same time, I can look at you and say, oh, you're a human, and you are kind of equally human with me and with all of the other humans that are out there. But that's in some ways to de-individualize you. But what is this abstract human thing that I am now conceptualizing? And what's the relationship between our abstract characterizations of the world and the particular observations that we then start to have? So Popper signs onto a kind of a soft but nonetheless important form of what we call theory-ladenness, where our background theories of the world literally shape how we see the world. And that, I think, opens the door to a kind of subjectivism, because then it pushes people into saying, well, we actually don't all see the same world. We're all seeing a partially subjective construct of the world, and that opens the door for some of the later skeptics. So your question was about Popper. That's kind of a somewhat rambling discussion of 4 or 5 elements, good and bad, in Popper.
Yeah, thank you for that. I did want to ask you today a question around what would you describe as the guiding Western philosophy at the moment? And then, if I could, if you've put thought into it, what would you describe the one in Russia? Because obviously there's massive conflict between the West and Russia at the moment. But when I look at Russia, they're not really, and in the East, yeah, I think a lot of people could suggest if we'd taken different paths, we could work with Russia and trade with Russia. And we have for many years in the past. I wonder, do you think there is a philosophical or ideological difference between the collective West and Russia which leads to this? Or do we have a similar underpinning in philosophy? What are your thoughts on that?
So that's two very big questions. So on the first one, what is the guiding philosophy in the West? I think I would have to say there isn't one. Right now, my sense is if you look just at philosophy departments, even just academic philosophy departments, there are, this is a little bit arbitrary, but 4 or 5 major schools out there, and they're all importantly different in various ways. So there are Enlightenment realists and advocates of reason, and I would be in that category. There are pragmatists, there are Heideggerians, there are Nietzscheans, and there are people who are postmoderns as well. So within philosophy, there is a lot of diversity going on.
Are they equally influential, do you feel, in the world today?
I haven't done the demographics on that, so I wouldn't be able to say. 20 years ago, I probably would have had a better answer to that. But I don't go, for example, to American Philosophical Association and Canadian Philosophical Association and do the number countings or track readership in the academic journals, who's reading what and so on, to be able to give you that. I just know that all of those positions are out there. Yeah. They have their articulate defenders and so on. At the same time, if you step outside of academics and go more broadly into the public intellectual spheres, that then is to say people who are serious intellectuals writing on history or whatever it is, politics or philosophy or religion, I think there is more of a general coherence there. People are still more individualistic, a little more optimistic, more pro-reason, and broadly speaking in favor of some sort of liberal democracy and market-oriented society. So at that very high level of abstraction, we can still say that's Western philosophy, except even there, I think, particularly in the last generation, is becoming more of a misnomer to call it Western philosophy. That's more of a historic designation to say that basically it started in the West, but it really has become international. For example, you and I are on other sides of the world, but nonetheless, I'm sure that we'll have things that we disagree about, but we are on the same general page. But are you Western?
I think we consider New Zealand, Australia. I think we're considered to be Western, part of the Western world, although we're very small players in it geopolitically.
But clearly it's a metaphorical extension.
Yes.
Of what we mean by Western.
Yes.
And people in Japan and South Korea, are they Western? Well, yes, they are, but yet they're not really. They are historically they're Eastern, and geographically they're still Eastern, and so on. So I tend to like better the label very broad, kind of more modern intellectual framework, or slightly narrower an Enlightenment intellectual framework. Now, where that stands with respect to Russian thinking. Now, this I think is a very interesting question. I've done some work on Dugin recently. I guess it was almost 2 months ago now. I gave a lecture in Poland, in Gdansk, on Dugin's political theory book. And I think Russia right now is a hybrid of traditional anti-Western philosophy, very deeply collectivistic. And so the idea of the autonomous individual in the broad mass of the Russian people, particularly the further east you go, is still quite alien. The kind of deep religiosity that still saturates modern Russian culture in Eastern Orthodox form, and the kind of top-down dictator worship. You go from the czars and their absolute power to the communists and their absolute power to someone like Putin with his near absolutist power. they've just got censored. They have no tradition of any sort of liberal, democratic, republican individualism. Now, that's to speak very broadly. I think if you are in Moscow and in Petersburg, you've got an intellectual elite who've done some traveling, who've read more widely, and who do not buy into that, and they want to westernize and modernize and so on. So this is just to speak very broadly about my understanding of Russian culture, and I think it is still largely anti-Western. Now, here's where I want to come to Dugin as a representative thinker, Alexander Dugin. He's probably the most famous philosopher currently in Russia, so he's got an international reputation. And nobody knows how true this is, but the people in Putin's inner circle read him and channel him in various ways. To my knowledge, Putin has never explicitly mentioned Dugin, though he has mentioned explicitly Putin in some of his speeches, some of the same philosophers Russian philosophers whom Dugin also draws upon. Mm. But I think the important thing, this is just to be the one point I will make there, is that among Russian intellectuals, again, this is an overstatement, but using Dugin as an example, when they say we are going to go to the West and import ideas from the West and adapt them to the Russian circumstance, they do not ever mean liberal, democratic, republican, pro-Enlightenment philosophers. They do never mean John Locke or John Stuart Mill or Ayn Rand, who coincidentally was Russian-born before she came to the United States, or Karl Popper. They always mean German collectivist philosophers. And in the case of Dugin, explicitly, over and over again, he will cite Heidegger, Martin Heidegger, as the great guru, that basically Heidegger's philosophy is right. Heidegger nailed it. And we need to adapt that to the Russian context. Now, why that matters is that Heidegger is also the exact same philosopher the leading postmodernists will say. We need to channel Heidegger and adapt him to the modern world. So, Foucault saying Heidegger is the essential philosopher for me. And Richard Rorty, the American, he also draws upon John Dewey and Wittgenstein, but in his Holy Trinity, that's
Heidegger's
that's a bit of
at
a
the
dig
top
there, but Heidegger is in his Holy Trinity of great philosophers. And Heidegger was a total collectivist, total hater of Western liberal democracy, hater of capitalism, hater of technology, and a card-carrying member of the National Socialist Party. He was a gung-ho Nazi. So what you then have is someone like Dugin saying, we need to take Heidegger, and basically what that means is take Heidegger's Nazism, which was crafted for the Germans. Yeah. The Germans got philosophy right. Only the Germans can do politics right. Germany is the future of the world, and just take that into Russia, and for everything that's German, say it's Russia. So it's a deep collectivism. It's a deep anti-rationalism. He hates liberalism in all of its form. He hates the modern world and wants basically to have a kind of Russian fascism.
Interesting. Yeah, interesting. Because those differences, we might see them sort of play out if Putin does listen to Dugin and is influenced by him. One question, which I think I guess I know the answer to this, but how important to culture is philosophy? And the reason I'm asking this is because I think a lot of people just really aren't aware of philosophy. Myself, growing up, going through my education, I studied none at high school. At university, I did an engineering degree, so there was nothing in that field. I've come to it much later in life. So I wonder what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah. No, I think philosophy is fundamental. And whether you know it or not explicitly, you're a very philosophical person. I think it's built into being a human being. Right when we are young, we start to think about philosophical issues. Who do I want to be? What are the important values in my life? Is love real? And how will I know if it's true? Is there really a God or not? And all of those are philosophical questions, and we all engage with them. And we all make up our minds about what our core values are and our core beliefs. are. Most people, I think what they do is they will do some independent thinking about all of those issues, but then they will, in effect, buy a ready-made philosophy off the shelf and then adopt that. But they kind of know what they're doing. You know, I'm going to be this religion, or I'm going to be this political ideology, or I'm going to commit to this way of doing my career, or I'm going to commit to this form of family life. But all of those come packaged with a set of values, and people create their character and they work on their character to fit right according to that. Now, and I think that's all fine. And I think, of course, not everybody is lucky enough to be a professional philosopher to get to do those things right for a living. But I do think people live better to the extent that they do explicitly attend to philosophy. And we do this sometimes, even if we're busy with life and family and career and so on. You know, we go to funerals and we think about the meaning of life. You know, this person died. Was it a good life? Was it a bad life? What can I learn from this? You know, that's going to be me at a certain amount. And in many cases, people will make resolutions to improve in various ways. Or when they're getting married, or they go through a bad breakup, or the birth of a child, or a major career change when they need to rethink their entire life. Those are all very, very philosophical moments. But at the same time, I think philosophy mostly works as a kind of infrastructure, a kind of an intellectual infrastructure. So the analogy I sometimes use when I'm talking with my students is like, when I get out in my truck and I'm driving around, there's all this infrastructure in place. There are the roads with lines painted on it and curbs and signs, right, of various sorts. And somebody thought through all of that infrastructure. And I learned about all of that infrastructure, but I've more or less automated it.
Yeah.
I think philosophy is largely like that. Somebody needs to think through all of the important issues in life, and then to set those structures in place. And parents do this for their children. Teachers do this. And then in movies, we do this. And so this infrastructure is presented, and then we accept elements of it, but then we more or less automate it. And so it becomes your psychological infrastructure, and you are being an applied philosopher, but without thinking about that infrastructure.
That infrastructure.
So that's the way I think it works. I think the example I like to use is myself here all of the time. I'm a philosopher, right, by training, but my last name is Hicks, and the etymological origin of that is farming. So and I come from a long line of farmers. It's just as many people came from a long line of farmers. But then I think, why is it that I am not standing behind a plow, as so many of my ancestors did? Right? Why, even in the modern world, am I not driving a tractor around all day, the way my grandparents did? Instead, I am in a world that modern philosophy has made. And so it was a philosophical revolution that said, we're going to be rational fundamentally. We're going to question. We're going to treat people as individuals.
That's amazing to me. Those philosophical decisions and the impact they have. Like that was, I think, the real eye opener for me a couple of years ago when I started to watch some of your videos, and I just realized the impact of a philosophy, an ideology, a way of thinking, and how that can influence a culture, and just how important that is. Which led me into some of these questions today around, what could become beyond this? How could we look to develop a philosophy to move the world forward positively? What would you need to do to influence that and make it become popular? They're very interesting topics, I think.
Yeah. So if I could just throw out one more analogy, I sometimes think in terms of, I think I should write this up and publish it, because I think I'm just exactly on this question. So if you imagine, a village in mountainous surroundings, the way philosophy is going to work is, what do parents teach about their kids about the surrounding mountains? Right? if you tell your kids from day one, this is the operative philosophy, in the mountains, there are evil spirits waiting to gobble you up if you go into those mountains. So that's the kind of philosophy. You know, the world is populated by evil spirits who are very powerful and they're out to get you, right? And you raise your kids that way, right? Versus you say, in those mountains, there's gold and precious metals. And if you go and explore them, you can become wealthy and prosperous. Well, then you're going to get a market-oriented engineering culture, completely different.
Yeah.
If you tell your young kids, beyond those mountains, there are other villages and other cultures and whole worlds to explore, and you should be prepared to go do that. You're going to raise three very different kind of cultures, and that's the philosophical decision from the exact same environmental circumstances.
That's the power of philosophy in a culture. And that's the thing which I think it's a shame it's not understood, it's not taught to the general population. And people just don't have enough time in their day, most people I think, to actually give time to think about it. I wonder, another question I wanted to ask was, as a philosopher who has the time to think, is there a way or a technique that you use when trying to think about a philosophy and to sort of clear the slate of your influences and biases so that you can kind of approach something from a clear position?
Yeah, that's a very good question about philosophical methodology, or actually just thinking methodology as well. And a lot of my professional life is spent reading other philosophers, historic and contemporary. And if I'm going to do that well, then I have to get inside their heads, so to speak. So I really have to, this is metaphorical, step outside of myself and sympathetically see the world the way they see the world. And in some ways, you know, if I'm doing this for a long time, I'm going to write an article or give a lecture on someone, you almost have to become that kind of person, right, for a while. But then, and this speaks more directly to your question, I spend a lot of time reading philosophers I disagree with hugely. So I then have to do the work of thinking my way out of all of that. And the way I put it to myself is, you know, now it's time to get back to reality. Because, you know, philosophy takes people to very weird places, and it can mess you up if you do it right. So a couple of things. One is part of philosophy is making explicit all of the implicit premises. And so training yourself when you make this move to this, to this, to this, to be aware if you are jumping over a step or if you are taking something for granted. And so making that explicit in many cases is very helpful. And just making the steps clear so that when you've gone down 20 steps, you know how to retrace those steps. And the other thing is asking myself regularly the question, you know, what facts of reality bear upon this? Because it's very easy for you to start spitting word clouds and fantasy theories, but as a heuristic check to say what would count as evidence for or against this, and then actually going and looking at the evidence. So there's a couple of quick things I would say in response to that.
Yeah, I personally find it's challenging for me to find the touchstones in philosophy, which I think you were sort of touching on there. Those things which you can consider as a fact. Okay, this is like a starting point for me. I can base my thinking from this, and you know, then being able to be confident that okay, this is a reliable touchstone. This thing is actually legitimate. Right. And this, I guess, comes from being a rationalist and believing in logic, and that I can actually develop a fact and use that as a starting point for thinking.
Right. Yeah.
How does that impact a postmodernist if they're rejecting that logic? It almost seems as though it's the snake eating its tails. Like they reject logic, yet they're
Yeah.
supposing things and suggesting and recommending approaches. So how does that work? Or is that a failing of postmodernism?
Postmodernists, particularly the postmodern intellectual activists, tend to use logic strategically. So they will use logic against you if that is that's doable. So they will marshal facts, they will marshal arguments, and they will lay out a logical chain of reasoning that's rational if it's in the service of undermining your position, putting you on the defensive. But then what they will typically do is that if you try to turn the tables on them and say, well, what about this fact? What about that fact? And what about this logical argument? Then what they will do is shift the terms of the debate to a philosophical discussion about logic.
Yeah.
Right. So you are assuming, right, that logic is valid or that there are such things as facts, and here are my skeptical arguments for why. Now that then diffuses your argument against the particular position they were able to do so. No, so I think some of the the postmodern intellectuals who are activists in that, so that's an explicit strategy for them. I think others will, other postmoderns, they do take the dismissal of logic and the dismissal of rationality more as a license just to believe whatever it is that they want. And so philosophy for them is it just becomes a more expressionistic enterprise. Just whatever's going on inside me, I put it out there, and it doesn't matter if it's coherent or not. The important point is that this expresses what's going on inside of me. So there's an analogy here to artistic traditions. If you think of, say, the Impressionists versus the Expressionists. So the Impressionists, like Monet, they're very interested in looking at the world and capturing these special moments that are actually going on in the world and their reactions to them, but the world is impressing upon them. And then in the next generation, you get the Expressionists, and you look at the works, and it's they don't really care what the world looks like. This is how I feel about the world in all kinds of disjointed emotionalist ways. And it's a subjectivistic enterprise that they are engaging in. That same divide runs through philosophy.
Yeah. Hey, maybe just one last question.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. Let's have at it.
If you're if you're interested in having a go at this one, but I wanted to ask about your thoughts on God, the concept of God. As a philosopher, and having researched so many people who have thought about this, what are your thoughts on God?
Yeah, well, I'm an atheist. I don't think any of the gods exist, and so I think the most important question is to think through the evidence and the arguments for the existence of God, and I reach negative conclusions on them. I don't want to appeal to authority, but I would say well over 90% of professional philosophers, if it's a matter of evidence and argumentation, will say the evidence isn't there, the arguments are not very good. So then the next question, I think this is where religion becomes more interesting to me, is to say, what is the idea of God doing for people? Mm-hmm. Because the fact that the evidence and arguments for the existence of God are not compelling does not necessarily mean that people who are believers in God are irrational and just indulging in their whims, right, and so on. Although some of them, I think, do so. And so then I think very quickly you get into philosophical issues. So there is a question. If you look at the world scientifically, the world is cause and effect. It's orderly. There are structures right out there. And then the question then is going to be a metaphysical question. Well, why is the world orderly? And you can understand people saying, well, the world needs some sort of glue to hang it together, and believing in a God as providing that kind of metaphysical glue. That's a hypothesis you can understand. And you can understand why they might say, without a God, everything's going to go to chaos. Or people want to say that ethics is important. We need to have there are healthy values. People need to have good character. And it's one of the big questions then. Well, where do we get these values from, and can we get them on a naturalistic basis? And there are debates about yes or no, and so you can understand the appeal of people who say, look, the world is full of temptations and it's messy, and people who take shortcuts sometimes seem to get ahead. And why can't I lie once in a while? And all of that conflicts with the idea that there has to be universal, more absolute, firm principles. And if they don't come from a naturalistic source, well, then an easy answer is to say there is some sort of a being that legislates that morality. And so I think those are more reasonable underpinnings to religion. And I would disagree philosophically with them, but that kind of person who believes in God for those reasons is in the camp. I do think, though, that there are lots of people who are religious for unsavory reasons. People who are just lazy. They just, I happen to be born where I was, and everybody in my community believes this, so that's what I believe because I don't feel like thinking about it. As if somehow magically you happen to be born into believing in exactly the right God. I think that's a lack of responsibility. I think as a human being, you have a responsibility to think through right the important things. I think some people are more social butterfly types, and for them their religion is a matter of social convenience. I think for other people, religion is a matter of fear response. If I think about death or whatever, it seems, if I'm just going to end up in a box and go out of existence, that's really hard emotionally to wrap my mind around. So I want to believe in a more comforting story about what happens, and that's a kind of subjectivism, and I don't think that's a healthy response. But I understand why people do it. So my standard answer to that then is to say, on my view, I think there are, that religion is not actually one thing. Right? Religion is a way of doing philosophy, and just like with any philosophy, there are better and worse ways of doing so. And I typically divide religions into, I think there's 5 different types of religion, and people put together their own package.
What are those 5?
For various, well, I'll just give you I'll give you, since time is short, we'll wrap it up. Okay. One of my favorite versions of this is what I heard when I was a young guy. I had very strongly Calvinist Presbyterian in-laws, and I also had some Pentecostal preachers in the family and so on. So, they would take us to church, and one of my forebears had a good sense of humor about religion, as well as being quite a serious religion guy. So we were talking about Christianity, and he said, Steve, there's 3 kinds of Christians. There are Christmas Christians, there are Good Friday Christians, and there are Easter Monday Christians. And there's something psychologically very true about that. So if you think about Christmas Christians, right? So Christmas is about celebration. It's about the birth of Jesus and the beginning of new life. And so it's very benevolent and happy and getting together with your family. And that's what your religion means to you, right? And that's in their heart of hearts what it's all about. But then if you think of the Good Friday Christians, that is, Jesus is executed, and he's executed horribly, and it's terrible, and we are supposed to be responsible for this. And so it's all death and agony and sin and guilt, right? And that's the core of what their religion means to them. And all of the S's is kind of drawn. And then the Easter Monday, it's not really about any of those things. What happens is Jesus rises from the dead. And so death is not final. There is the possibility of life after death. And you desperately want this not to be the whole story. You want to, when you die, to have your life carry on. And so it's not about suffering and guilt and so on. It's not about Christmas benevolence and so on. It's really pinning your hopes on the afterlife.
Yeah.
So all of those are, very philosophical ways of thinking about the religion, but that I think does capture 3 very different strands within within, just within Christianity. You can find variations on that. But there are, of course, other forms of Christianity that are more intellectualized. So if you think about the kind of person who becomes a mystic or strives to become a mystic, they're not so much thinking about the afterlife or thinking about death and guilt or benevolence and Christmas and so on. They want the ultimate secret of the universe, and so they are on a quest to transcend this world and find the secrets of the universe and to intellectually comprehend God. And I think that's another, very different type of religion. And I guess while we're on it, to round things out, I think there are those for whom religion is much more of a social and political matter. They're not so much your individual, what happens to you after life or family and cognition. It's matter that we need religion as a social glue or as a political fabric, because we're part of a community and we need to have a shared belief system. And so religion is very important, primarily for social and political reasons, and the rest is playing a supporting role. So is that up to five? I
that's
think
five.
Five.
Yeah, that's a really interesting take on religion.
Maybe I should write that up someday.
You should. Well, we got it on video. But one last thing. What are you What are you up to? What have you got coming out, or what are you doing these days with your with your work and the Center for Entrepreneurship and Ethics?
Yeah. Well, I've got a lot of travel in the first half of this year, so I'm juggling lecture preparing and debate preparation and all of that kind of stuff, and just the travel time, which is time consuming. But I do have a course that's more focused on entrepreneurial issues and character issues that I've teamed up with Professor Barbara Oakley, and we're developing a course for Coursera that will be available to everyone on. Basically, the official title is Critical Thinking Leadership, but it's really about entrepreneurship and critical thinking and creative thinking and how to build effective organizations. So that ties in with the other. The other big project I'm working on is a couple of years ago I published. Actually, it was just across the pond from you with an Australian publisher, a book called Liberalism, Pro and Con, in which I laid out 15 of what I took to be the best, most influential arguments for liberalism, and then counterposed to them the 15 most powerful anti-liberal arguments coming from a variety of political spectrums. So the idea here was, since so many books in politics are, here are my views and here are my arguments for them, and you kind of do a straw man version of your opponents and they're all idiots anyways, to take seriously that if we're going to make progress, we need to understand the best arguments on each side. So it's a kind of primer of 30 arguments laid out. So then I published that book, but the sequel to that is then to say, okay, these are the 15 arguments. And my analysis is that when you look at the 15 arguments and you try to find where the deep disagreements are, most of them, not all of them, but the majority of them are really about philosophical issues. Mm-hmm. They're about values. They're about epistemology. They are about metaphysics. And that's my area of expertise. So then what I'm working on is going through what I take to be the 15 deepest disagreements and saying, this is what I think the right answer on those and why it's the right answer, and then responding to the other side of the arguments.
And so that book's in preparation, is it, the sequel?
That book is in preparation now.
Great. Okay.
I'm anticipating end of 2024, given my current other shorter articles and travel commitments.
Okay. Hey, thank you very much for today.
Well, thank you, Tim. Great questions. And boy, that hour flew by very quickly.
Yeah, it was really enjoyable talking to you.
Good.
If you're ever in New Zealand, sing out and come into the studio. Let's do another one.
Will do. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, New Zealand is very high on our list. So cool. It might very well happen.
All right. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, sir. Bye for now.
Bye. I will, Stephen, I will send you through. I'll just stop the recording.